Sure, and I'll try to give you a broad overview of the overall funding. The project, as we understand it, is anticipated to be about a $1.5 billion project. Now, that doesn't include land, but of course, with the final destination of this project being on the Tropicana site, land is not an issue. 9 acres has been set aside by those who own and control the property at the Tropicana, and the rest of that 38-acre parcel will be redeveloped and be supportive of that development on that corner. So to fund all of that, the team, as we understand it, is putting in about $1 billion worth of funding into the $1.5 billion ballpark. The public will be putting about $350 million. The bill says $380 million, and it could vary between $350 and $380. As you well know, Zenny, the time at which we tried to nail down most of these numbers, interest rates were at a certain level and those sorts of things. And by the time we actually issue the bonds, which I'm guessing will be, I don't know, 12 to 18 months from now, something like that. Interest rates could vary from where they are today. So it could be a little bit more, a little bit less. We've kind of fixed the revenue sources that would support this. But of that $350 million that comes from the public side, or $380 million that comes from the public side, about $180 million will come from transferable tax credits. That comes directly from the state of Nevada. And over time, there's an expectation that most of that, all but about $60 million, would be repaid from cash flows. So let me back up for a moment and get back to the bonding portion of this. That is really a piece that will be carried out by Clark County. And right now it's estimated that the total project proceeds from that bond issue would be about $120 million. Again, that's based on current interest rates and those sorts of things. So it could vary a bit from that. That bonding, any bond that you issue has to be supported by a source of repayment. And the source of repayment in this case is a little bit unique because we're used to seeing, and I'm sure you are in California as well, bond issues that are supported by property tax, those that commonly go on to your ballots down there for approval, or supported by specific taxes like sales tax or motor vehicle fuel tax. Those are pretty straightforward. And usually those carry what's referred to as a general obligation backing from the issuing entity. So if it was Alameda County and they were using some fuel tax for road projects, chances are they would put the full faith and credit of Alameda County behind that. That secures you a better rate, that gets you more proceeds, that gets you lower debt service payments. The credit quality is always extraordinarily important. Now, in this particular case, we've done something a little different. I know it's a topic that it's near and dear to your heart, but the area surrounding the stadium is going to be referred to as a special entertainment improvement district, an SEID, and that's a new thing here in Nevada. And essentially that's a dotted line drawn around the proposed stadium, and all of the tax revenues that are generated within that boundary will be put into a separate bucket and used to secure the bonds for this particular project. Now, what I just described to you is the essence of something, again, I know is near and dear to you because you've spent a lot of time working on it yourself over the years, but that's a tax increment financing.
Yep. Yeah.
So sales tax and employment related taxes and other forms of public revenue that are generated within those 9 acres will all be put into a separate account. That account will then be used to pay the principal and interest, much like a mortgage that people take out on their homes over a 30-year period. The revenue that comes into that will service that the bonds that are issued, or in an analogous way, the mortgage, if you will, the contractual obligation that we have as Clark County to repay that, and it'll also be backed by the full faith and credit of the county, which should get us preferential interest rates. So it's kind of a new twist. Tax increment has existed in a lot of forms, in a lot of places. It's very common for things like redevelopment, as I know that you've spent a lot of time with over your years in working with the public sector. That's generally just a property tax type of capture.
Yeah.
We have sales tax increment districts here in the state of Nevada that are tourism oriented. And essentially, we decided to take that idea a step or two further with a special entertainment improvement district as we've created for this particular case. Now, to contrast that for a moment, because I know some of the folks that follow you are also interested in Allegiant Stadium, the now home of the Raiders. Done a little bit differently as a part of the legislation that approved. Now, here in Nevada, we need legislation for nearly everything we do at the local level because we're far from what is referred to as a home rule state. So we had to seek legislation both in the case of the Raiders and the A's to do the kinds of financings that we're talking about here. And in the case of the Allegiant Stadium and the Raiders, a special additional room tax was levied, and that's what's being used to repay the bonds for, and that's on a county-wide basis.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's being used to repay the bonds on Allegiant Stadium. So quite different sources of security. With something like a room tax, we have a lengthy history with room tax here. We know how that performs over time. We know how it performs during recessions. We've recently learned how it performs during something like COVID. So we have a lot of information about that. With something like the Sports and Entertainment Improvement District, that's something where you don't have a lot of history, and it's largely based on projections that are done by experts in the field of sports, Legends, CSL, a number of others have looked at numbers that were used to generate the estimates that we were using to construct the financing for this. So hopefully in part of that answer, I've covered what you've hoped I would.
Oh yeah, that was more than perfect. I was going to get away some questions. I think some of these have been explained, but just these are lay people. So Hopers, who's a regular viewer, he says, I assume that all these bonds are federal and tax exempt.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a great question because the normal thinking is that anything that you issue from a municipal standpoint, in both of these cases, Allegiant and I suppose the yet to be named stadium where the A's will potentially be playing, since they're municipally backed, you assume that they're tax exempt. It's not quite that simple. And that's what makes this a great question, because we had to spend a lot of time with tax counsel and bond counsel talking through the particulars of this. Both of these facilities will be publicly owned. That certainly helps in this. The use that goes on inside is private use, and that's one of the things that generates the questions. But to the questions that we have with bond and tax counsel, because private use and public use are two different things, and normally private use is taxable, public use is tax exempt. To make a super long and probably horrifyingly boring story shorter, our preliminary determination is that both of these will be issued on a tax exempt basis.
And our viewers are never bored by that. That's just FYI. And then he says, can you explain bonds so someone doesn't get what they are? And I think what this person is looking for is it fair to say that a bond, just to simplify things, is a kind of loan?
That's absolutely what it is. A bond is essentially, if you hold a bond, you hold something that is a promise to pay on the part of those who you lend money to. So if you're the holder of a bond, you've been a part of a group that lent money to a borrower, and the bond is evidence of your portion of a promised repayment. So it's kind of like, again, using the mortgage example. Mortgages are simple because usually that's a bank or some other form of financial institution that originates those loans for a homeowner, and the mortgage is the contractual obligation to repay it. So if you try to make that analogy work, a bond is the contractual obligation for repayment of that obligation. It's evidence of a form of security. These are securities, so they're largely regulated. There's a tremendous amount of oversight that goes into the issuance of these. It's certainly not a trivial matter to issue bonds like this, but it's just another form of lending.
And yes, will these bonds be callable?
Another great question. I'm impressed with these questions, Zennie.
That's the smart viewers.
Yeah, no, I like it. I like it. Pretty typically these days, all bonds that are issued by municipalities have a call feature. And usually in today's market, that usually is a 10-year call provision. In other words, we're essentially saying to those from whom we're borrowing the money, we're not going to call these bonds for 10 years. If we were to say to them, hey, we would really like to be able to call these bonds in 5 years, the market would look at that somewhat negatively and they would charge us for that. So we would pay a higher rate to have a shorter call. One of the reasons why the call period is super important to us these days. Let's go back to the mortgage example for a moment. If you take out a mortgage and all of a sudden interest rates go down, you could call your financial institution and discuss with them refinancing that mortgage. And you do that to save money, both on a cash flow basis each year and also on a total term of the mortgage, right? We'd like to do the same thing with bonds. As interest rates go down over time, we would like to be able to refund these bonds. Now, refund is the term that we use in the municipal finance world for refinancing those bonds to get a lower interest rate. And you can't do that really during the call period anymore. So we watch those very closely. Allegiant Stadium, we're probably 5 years away from the call date on those bonds, at which time we would be looking for opportunities to refinance those. So the call becomes very, very important. It's an assurance to the owner of the bond that these bonds won't be called, and I can rely on this tax exempt interest for at least that 10-year period.
Mm-hmm.
And for the other side, for the borrowing side, the municipal side, that tells us when we could look at opportunities to refinance the debt.
Okay.
Great question.
Yeah, I'm going to rush through some of these because first of all, Hopus says, how well are these? He says the full faith and credit of Nevada, presumably not backing the bonds. It's the county, right? Yeah. And
yes, it'll be a pledge by Clark County, and Clark County's rating is AA+, AA1, which is awfully.
And then Hopus asks how well received will they be in the market? I would think that with what happened with Allegiant, and you're doing Clark County, right? So that's.
Hey, I mean, really, for those of your listeners and followers that buy bonds, I think one of the things you look at right away is the credit rating on those bonds. And usually, if you see the words general obligation, you feel very, very secure about the form of repayment. So in essence, the form of repayment for these bonds is not only that revenue coming off of the Sports and Entertainment Improvement District, and I think I might have misspoken earlier when I referred to it as a special entertainment improvement district. It's so new, I'm still learning the name of our own thing here, but Sports and Entertainment Improvement District revenues will be pledged to pay off those bonds. And in the event that revenue is insufficient, the full faith and credit of the county is there to back it as well. And this is another feature of the legislation. 1/2 times annual coverage from the state of Nevada, which doesn't pledge the state's full faith and credit. It just provides some additional coverage or backing for the bonds. So they're very secure. And because they carry the name Clark County and because they also are general obligation, I think they'll be very well received by the market. It really has very little to do with what the project is, although in some cases, I think there are individuals that are maybe more enticed to buy a bond that has something to do with, say the Raiders or Allegiant Stadium or something like that. But it really has very little to do with the credit.
Yeah. Manchester, I'm going to skip yours because it's a land use question, but the answer is that uh, the question is, in fairness, is a strip big enough on Lakers to have a retractable roof? Well, you are putting together a stadium, but the roof is on top of it. So it's not so much a width issue, it's really height. And therefore, since we're talking about acreage, the answer is it's just fine. Uh, then it says, when is the expected issue of the bonds? I think you said 12 to 18 months, right? So thereabouts. Okay, yeah. So now it gets to my question. My question is, first of all, when did you get involved with talking with the A's, Dave Coball and the A's?
Well, I became aware of the potential for this project roughly 2 years ago. First conversation I had was with Dave Coball, and I think it was in April of 21, and it was just a 50,000 foot type of call about the possibilities or potential that something like this may happen. Over the next several months, my role in this is somewhat limited because I'm primarily I represent Clark County as their municipal or financial advisor. And that's largely the same role I had with Allegiant Stadium, although that one was done a bit differently. The county was more of a presence at the table in working out the overall financial structure for Allegiant Stadium than it was for SB1 of this last session, which is related to the A's stadium. So as things moved toward the beginning of the state legislature this past February, I became very, very engaged in that entire process, and in particular, anything that might affect the county having to issue debt and the terms under which the county would be agreeable to issuing that debt. And that was a very, very complicated process. Far more complicated than Allegiant Stadium, and far more complicated than most of the bond issuances that we work on here in the state.
Why?
Well, again, you're talking about creating a new type of taxing district, so that adds one layer of complication. You're talking about potential credit issues that are unlike pledging something that's known, like sales tax or property tax or motor vehicle fuel tax, things like that. So we had a lot of workarounds to do there. One of your listeners asked about taxable or tax exempt. That's something that we had to work through, and the conditions under which the bonds could be tax exempt, because that's highly preferable. Issues relating to coverage, issues relating to debt reserve. Now, all of these things that we're now talking about, coverage and debt reserves and things like that, are things that don't necessarily affect the sellability of the bonds. Now, again, you as a buyer of the bonds would look at it and say, hey, Clark County, AA rated, general obligation backed, I'm in. The next order of business is really as important, and that is protecting the security of the county and the state of Nevada. If something were to go wrong, and look, we all make projections, and we have some that come awfully close. We have some that are wildly different over time. Now, when you're looking at a 30-year period of repayment of bonds, you have to take into account everything that you think could happen over those 30 years. We know that there will probably be 2 or 3 recessionary periods over a 30-year period. Heck, Zennie, if you would have asked me 5 years ago, one of the things that I wouldn't have listed was a pandemic,
right,
and the effects that can have on an economy. So there are things that you could think about that could cause variations in revenues over time that could affect the ability to repay debt. It's usually the things you could never think of that are the ones that happen over a 30-year period, right? And
Yeah.
so all of that combined, tells me as the advisor to the county that we have to be extremely conservative and provide every protective measure possible for any variation that could occur over a 30-year period. Now, that becomes complicated because, and these are terms that I know I've spoken with you about in the past, but we require 2 times coverage, which means that you have to have twice as much revenue projected each year as debt service payable each year. And that's to accommodate for those variances in the performance of revenue over time. And we're also requiring a 2-year reserve, the first of which will be funded as a part of the issuance of the bonds. The second will be funded out of cash flow. One is for variance of the estimates over time, and the other one is for liquidity. Because sometimes when the debt payments are due, they're due on particular days. The cash is accruing, and if the cash doesn't match the amount that's due on that particular day, the last thing in the world you want is a technical default. That doesn't speak well of the credit, right? So you maintain reserves to provide the liquidity to be able to get past that. And as you, I know, are aware, in the early years following the issuance of bonds for Allegiant Stadium, we had to, and fortunately we had them, we had to use some of the reserves that we had set aside because of COVID and the impact that it had on room tax.
Mm-hmm.
We're fortunately back to a point where we're almost at the pre-COVID levels in terms of the reserves. We've recaptured all of that.
Congratulations.
But everything I described to you is, the type of thing that causes sleepless nights for people in public finance, and that is making sure that you've created enough security that there will never be a default on the bonds that your name is associated with.
What was it like working with the A's versus the Raiders and everybody else?
You mean from an interpersonal perspective, or?
Take it as you wish. Yeah. Open.
Oh, okay. Well, again, it was a little bit different because the county's role with the A's was a bit different than it was with Allegiant Stadium. With Allegiant Stadium, the county was in the room as early as any of the parties were in the room. Obviously, the stake for the county with Allegiant Stadium was more than twice what it is with the A's, and consequently, it's the first of these types of things that we had been involved with directly. We were very good at issuing debt and very good at doing it in a very conservative way, very good at maintaining the high credit quality of the county. But something like a stadium was a bit of a new venture, even here in Las Vegas. This last time around, the A's and the state, I think, worked more closely together. The county was a bit of a late entry into that process, but nonetheless, we still accomplished everything from the county's perspective that we needed to protect the credit of the county and hopefully the state as well. So it's just a little bit different. I think we had a bit more, reflecting back on it, Zennie, I think we had a bit more lead time with Allegiant Stadium to work into the special legislative session and then work into the drafting of all of the various agreements. Here we had a much more compressed timeline because of the legislative session. So they were similar in some ways, but different in a lot of